In 1402, the Ottoman Empire lay in ruin. The catastrophic defeat of Bayezid I by Timur at the Battle of Ankara had done more than shatter an army, it fractured the very soul of the empire. With Bayezid captured, and his sons turning against one another in a civil war that would last over a decade, the once mighty Ottoman state became a battlefield of rival claimants. But while war raged between brothers and territories slipped into the hands of rebels and opportunistic enemies, a deeper crisis took root, one of economic collapse and military disintegration. The treasury was empty. Trade routes had crumbled. The once feared Ottoman army was scattered, divided between princes. By the time Mehmed I emerged as the victor of the Interregnum in 1413, he inherited not an empire, but a shell. His mission was clear: reunify the Ottoman world, stabilize its economy, and rebuild its broken military from the ground up. Mehmed I did not begin his rule with grand conquests or extravagant displays of power. Instead, he ruled with humility and focus, understood that military might was nothing without the coin to fund it, and public loyalty was nothing without a stable livelihood. His approach was measured, not reactive. He first addressed the economic hemorrhage bleeding the empire dry. During the Civil War, tax collection had become inconsistent or ceased entirely in many regions. Local governors had begun hoarding wealth, and rival factions had created parallel economic systems. Our merchants feared investing. Farmers abandoned their fields. The foundations of economic life were trembling. Mehmed responded with reform. He reinstated the Timar system, a form of land tenure in which soldiers and officials were granted land in return for military service and local tax collection. But unlike previous rulers who had allowed abuses within this system, Mehmed implemented checks to ensure that the revenue from each timar was directed properly. He appointed inspectors to audit provincial accounts and dismissed corrupt officials who had exploited their power during the Civil War. Local leaders were summoned to Edirne and made to swear loyalty, not just politically, but economically. They were expected to restore trade, farming, and labor systems or face swift replacement. One of his most brilliant strategies was stabilizing the currency. During the Interregnum, debased coins had flooded the markets, eroding trust in Ottoman money. Merchants preferred Byzantine or Venetian coins. Mehmed ordered the minting of new high-purity silver coins and circulated them widely across both Anatolia and the Balkans. To encourage their use, he paid his soldiers, officials, and even construction laborers in the new currency, forcing its rapid adoption. He also standardized taxation rates, which had varied wildly under different claimants during the Civil War. By creating predictable revenue streams and restoring the value of money, he rebuilt economic confidence. Mehmed knew that the economy alone could not secure the empire. The military, once the pride of the Ottomans, had been reduced to fragmented bands of mercenaries and partisan forces. Loyalty had become regional, not imperial. In some provinces, soldiers pledged allegiance to governors instead of the sultan. In others, disillusioned fighters turned to banditry. Mehmed began the painful but necessary process of reorganization. First, he disbanded unreliable troops and revoked their privileges. He brought back the Janissary Corps, once the elite fighting force of the empire, and placed them under direct central command again. Promotions were no longer based on political favoritism, but performance and discipline. To fund this military revival, Mehmed redirected state revenue to the central military treasury. This move angered some governors, who had grown used to hoarding regional wealth. But Mehmed was unrelenting. He reminded them that without a unified army, the empire would fall back into chaos. He then reopened military academies that had been shut during the Interregnum and introduced training reforms, bringing back drills, archery, and strategic education. These reforms weren't just cosmetic. Within 5 years, the Ottoman military had regained its structure, discipline, and effectiveness. It was no longer a coalition of rival warlords, but a singular, loyal force. To further secure both economy and army, Mehmed restored infrastructure. Roads damaged during the war were repaired, bridges were rebuilt. Caravans began moving again, connecting Anatolia with the Balkans. These roads served both trade and military movement. Markets reopened. Cities like Bursa and Adorn began to hum with activity. Taxes began to flow steadily into the capital. The empire slowly but surely began to resemble the powerful state it once was. What made Mehmed's approach unique was his understanding that stability came not from conquest, but from careful management. He avoided costly wars and prioritized internal healing. He met with local leaders regularly, listened to grievances, and mediated disputes. His military generals were not just warriors, they were trained to act as administrators and protectors of local populations. This approach earned him trust across social classes. The poor saw him as a provider. The merchants saw him as a stabilizer. The army saw him as a rebuilder. By the time Mehmed I neared the end of his reign in 1421, the empire was not yet an unstoppable force, but it was stable, growing, and prepared for greatness. His efforts did not make headlines in the style of conquerors or warriors. But historians now recognize that without his economic reform and military restoration, the conquests of his son Murad II and grandson Mehmed, the conqueror, would never have been possible. Mehmed I was the architect not of expansion, but of rebirth. As Mehmed I entered the later years of his reign, the transformation of the Ottoman Empire from fractured chaos to relative stability was nothing short of remarkable. His early focus on repairing the empire's economy and military had created a sense of national cohesion that had not been felt in years. But Mehmed understood that true stability could not rely on short-term solutions alone. The empire was to survive future storms and, one day, thrive again as a dominant force. It would need systems that could outlast him. He therefore focused the final years of his life on reinforcing institutions, strengthening succession, and building an enduring framework for economic and military resilience. One of Mehmed's priorities was to ensure that the Ottoman economy became self-sustaining. His earlier reforms, currency stabilization, tax standardization, and trade restoration, were vital, but now he began thinking long-term. He encouraged the revival of craft guilds in urban centers such as Bursa and Idern. Artisans, blacksmiths, clothmakers, and silversmiths were granted protection and incentives to expand production. These guilds didn't just drive local economies. They played a key role in creating a skilled workforce that could supply both military needs and civilian markets. The army needed uniforms, weapons, and provisions. The people needed goods for trade. Mehmed's policies linked economic output directly to imperial strength. To further this goal, he established state workshops and supply centers, particularly for military logistics. These workshops, called imrits, became hubs of economic activity where goods were produced, stored, and distributed efficiently. By creating these centers near roads and garrisons, Mehmed ensured that the army would be well equipped even in remote campaigns. In essence, he developed the first version of a centralized war economy, an approach that would later be refined by future sultans. This system also reduced the empire's dependence on foreign goods, particularly from Venice and Genoa, with whom trade relations were unpredictable at best and hostile at worst. But Mehmed did not stop at manufacturing. He understood that land equals wealth, and so he implemented a land registry system to clarify property rights and taxation. Many lands had changed hands illegally during the Interregnum, and local disputes had made farming dangerous. By sending teams of surveyors and legal scholars to document land ownership, Mehmed restored fairness and efficiency to the agrarian economy. More land came under cultivation, more farmers returned to work. And most importantly, more taxes flowed into the state treasury, funding everything from infrastructure to soldiers' salaries. As the economic framework grew stronger, Mehmed simultaneously worked to entrench military discipline and strategic readiness. Having rebuilt the Janissary corps in earlier years, he now focused on rotating regional levies troops, raised from specific provinces. During wartime, troops were given periodic training, even during peacetime. A major change from previous generations where levies were poorly equipped and barely trained. The inclusion of local commanders and imperial military councils also created a sense of unity and professional pride across the ranks. Military leadership became more standardized, reducing the influence of personal loyalty and replacing it with institutional hierarchy. He also revived the Sipahi cavalry system, ensuring that each cavalryman had not just military duties, but also administrative responsibilities over land and local order. This double role turned military officers into agents of imperial control, extending state authority into far-flung corners of the empire. By balancing power between the elite Janissaries and the provincial Sepahis, Mehmed avoided the internal rivalries that had weakened previous rulers. Both forces were well paid, regularly inspected, and commanded through a centralized hierarchy that reported directly to the Sultan's court. Perhaps one of Mehmed I's most strategic long-term moves was the reinvestment in religious and educational institutions. While this may seem unrelated to economy or military, it was, in fact, a deeply calculated decision. He knew that sustainable empire building required more than swords and coins. It needed legitimacy, culture, and moral authority. He commissioned the repair of damaged mosques, built new madrasas, Islamic schools, and supported Sufi orders like the Mevlevis and Bektaşis. These spiritual and educational centers became hubs of Ottoman identity, teaching loyalty to the empire and instilling discipline, particularly among the rural population. This ideological unification had profound military implications as well. Many Janissaries were recruited through the Devshirme system, which took young Christian boys, converted them to Islam, and trained them as elite soldiers. By investing in their spiritual and educational upbringing, Mehmed ensured they became not just warriors but loyal subjects, deeply rooted in Ottoman values. The same was true for local leaders and judges who administered justice in villages and cities. Their training under Mehmed's reform system emphasized law, accountability, and service to the state. It was an empire-wide culture shift, achieved not by war, but by careful governance. As Mehmed's health began to decline around 1420, he became increasingly focused on securing the succession. He had seen firsthand the horrors of civil war between brothers, did not want his son Murad to suffer the same fate. Rather than leaving the throne open to contest, Mehmed prepared Murad for power with deliberate care. He gave him administrative duties early, allowing him to govern from Amasya, a traditional training ground for Ottoman heirs. Murad was taught finance, law, and military command, just through tutors but through lived experience. When Mehmed died in 1421, Murad II took the throne without resistance. There was no bloodshed, no rebellion. That peaceful transfer of power was perhaps Mehmed's greatest triumph and the legacy. Within a few short years, Murad II would expand Ottoman control over the Balkans, defeat Crusader alliances, and lay the groundwork for the conquest of Constantinople by his own son Mehmed II. But none of it would have been possible without the economic reforms, military restoration, and governance structures implemented quietly by Mehmed I. He did not seek glory through conquest, nor did he rule through fear. His rule was about foundation, not fireworks. He was the silent architect of one of history's greatest empires. Mehmed I died young, in his mid-30s, but he left behind an empire no longer in ruins. In a span of just 8 years, he had taken a broken, bankrupt, and divided state, and turned it into a functioning, centralized power ready to meet the world again. His efforts to rebuild the Ottoman economy and military may not have earned him the dramatic titles that later sultans enjoyed, but his influence was undeniable. Without Mehmed I, there would be no conquest of Constantinople. Without his reforms, there would be no golden age of Suleiman. His legacy was not built in battle, but in the hard, quiet work of empire restoration.